Welcome to the GT350 Garage. My name's Walter. I'm working on the steering box on my 66 Shelby today. And this is the original steering box that's in the car, and it is worn out. Also, the bottom seal on the box has pushed completely out of the box from being overpacked with grease. So water can get into the box. It actually has rough spots in it because it's worn out and lots of play. When I've driven this car years ago, the steering wheel has a solid eighth of a turn of play, if not a quarter of a turn of play on center. It was not really a fun experience to drive this car just because the car felt so sloppy. So the new steering box should tighten that up and make the car feel fresh again. Not that a vintage steering box is going to feel like rack and pinion, because let's face it, it won't. But it'll tighten the car up enough that the steering box won't be the issue anymore. And with a good alignment, the car should actually drive really nice and track really well. The new steering box that I'm putting in is a reproduction from Scott Drake. It's a nice box. I'm going to show you how to find center on the box, and I'm going to show you the steps that you have to take to remove the box. And then once we've got the old box out, we'll deal with putting the new one in. So with that, let me touch on one thing and then we'll get started. If you like the videos, give thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be doing more stuff like this. I'm getting into more complex projects on the car, and I'll be showing more hands-on stuff. The next couple of videos are all going to be on steering, suspension, brakes. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications so that you can see when this stuff comes along, and we can use the information to help you with your project too. Anyways, so with that, let's get started. Okay, I'm going to show you guys how to take a steering wheel off. And despite what most of the manuals and videos on the internet are going to show you, you don't need a puller. So let me see if I can sneak in here past the camera. All right, I've turned the wheel all the way to lock and turned it back just a little bit so that you can see what's going on. The cap on this wheel for the center cap actually just pulls right off. Now underneath that you have the center nut that holds the steering wheel to the steering column. Behind that is a splined column shaft, and there's splines in the hub of the steering wheel. So what we're going to do is get a 1-inch socket, turn the wheel until it hits the lock. It'll help you, and then take this nut off. Don't lose the nut. There's a hole at the top and at the bottom of the hub. The thread pitch on them is 5/16 24. If you need to use a puller to get the steering wheel off, you're going to put 2 bolts in there through the puller mechanism, center your puller on the shaft, and you'll extract the steering wheel off by pulling it off the shaft. Here's the thing. Usually these wheels come right off, and it just takes a little effort and the wheel comes off. and that's it. It's actually that simple. If you twist it on the splines just a smidge, it'll slide right off. Now, this steering box is coming out of the car. You have this spring that has to be removed, and we'll take the top of the column apart so that we can release the steering shaft from the upper bearing so that it doesn't bind as we're trying to take the long shaft steering box out. So now we're going to take the pitman arm off of the steering box. We've got the steering wheel or the steering column is turned all the way to lock left. So with it all the way at lock left, this nut is actually coming off pretty good for one that hasn't been off, as far as I know, in 50-something years. Now you might ask, why is the pitman arm still attached to the drag link? And that's because I'm not replacing the tie rod ends. They were all replaced about 3,500 miles ago, and they are all in extremely good shape. So rather than damage or risk damaging the boots on them, I'm simply removing the pitman arm from the steering box. And I'm using a pitman arm puller. And I promise I haven't taken this apart. It's just surprisingly, shockingly easy to take apart. All right, at this point, what's left is to remove the bolts attaching the steering box to the frame rail, and with those out, then we'll be able to worm the steering box out of the car. There's so much undercoating on the car that in order to get the socket on, I'm having to actually tap it on with a hammer to knock the undercoating off the head of the bolts. There, you heard it seat. Once the bolts are out of the way, I can start scraping the undercoating from this area. Now I will say this is going to be a lot easier to do with no engine in the way. If your engine's in the car, I wouldn't expect it to go super easy. Okay, I forgot to take the steering column loose from the bottom of the dash. It's just 2 1/2-inch bolts or nuts on studs. And once you remove that, it frees the entire steering column tube and makes it a whole lot easier to get the steering column to move so that you can slide the steering box out of the way. So at this point, I'm going to climb under the car and pull the steering box out. Okay, when you're servicing the Pitman arm, there are a couple of these wide splines. The wide splines are there so that you don't get the Pitman arm out of alignment and make it so that you can't get the car to turn lock to lock. So you have to be careful and pay attention and make sure you know where you're at with relationship to the steering box, and get everything centered up, and then line those splines up as you're installing the Pitman arm. Okay, I want to show you how to find center on a steering box. So grab a paint pen and make a mark, and then make a corresponding mark on the steering shaft so that the two marks are in a line. Okay? Let's see. You can see that they're there, but there we go. All right. Count your turns. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a little bit. Okay. Now, make a new mark. All right? So we know we're 4 and a bit, right? So we're going to go back 1, 2, and then we're simply going to split that difference right down the middle on that black mark. And that's centered. Okay? Now, to make sure that you don't lose that, come back up here to the top, find your spline, mark it, and mark your box. And now you know where center is. So if the steering shaft gets moved during installation, you can find center on this box, and you don't have to count turns and worry about whether or not you're centered. And then you'll know exactly where to put the steering wheel. So anyways, it just makes it a whole lot easier. All right, so the steps I showed you on how to center the box and how to mark the box to make sure it's centered are really important. And they're important for two reasons. The first reason is if you have your wheels pointing straight forward when you install the Pitman arm back onto the new box, you're not going to have the car realigned if you don't take any of the other steering components apart. Now, if you start disassembling the rest of the steering components, then yeah, you might have to have the car realigned. But if you don't mess with the tie rods, then there shouldn't be an issue. You should be able to just go right back to driving the car with the new steering box in it. The other reason it's really important that you center that steering box up is once you have everything centered up, the wheels are straight, you've got the Pitman arm on, then knowing that that box is still centered, you can put the steering wheel on and know that when the steering wheel goes on and you put it in place, it's going to be centered on the box, and you're not going to have to worry about taking the wheel back off because you're driving down the road with the steering wheel turned to one side or the other. So the installation process is basically the reverse of taking it apart. The only challenge is running the wiring through the steering column for the turn signal. I'm going to actually do a separate video covering the turn signal installation so that you guys can see how I fish those through there. It's a little challenging, but it's not bad. And there's a trick that I learned 30 years ago for getting the wires through the steering column, and it works every time, and it works like a charm. So I'll show you guys all that in the turn signal installation video, or turn signal switch installation video. So I'm going to cover the turn signal So reassembling the steering column is basically the same as taking it apart. The only thing is routing the wiring through the steering column. And I'm going to cover that in a separate video for turn signal switch replacement. I just think that's probably a good video in and of itself. I've got some tips and tricks that I could show you guys on how to get the wiring through the steering column and such that will help with that portion of the project. So make sure you get everything centered up, keep your wheels straight, center your box, install your pitman arm, look up the torque spec for the nut on the pitman arm, make sure you torque that to spec. You don't want that coming off while you're driving down the road. And the torque spec for the bolts on the actual steering box itself, those you don't want those coming loose either. But other than that, it's a pretty straightforward process. If you have to do this job with the engine in the car, you're going to want to take the steering column tube as far out of the car as possible. So when you disconnect it under the dash, it'll slide completely out through the firewall. That's going to be necessary to be able to do it with the engine in the car. And if you have a car with a manual transmission, you're probably going to need to remove the clutch Z-bar and get that out of the way so that you have some room to work in there. Just because things are pretty tight and cramped, and as you're trying to work it from the top and the bottom to get that box out of there, you're going to need some room. You know, if you have headers on the car, you'll probably have to take the driver's side header off the car to be able to get the steering box out. It's just the nature of the beast. These cars are packaged pretty tightly, and these early cars with the long steering shafts are an extra challenge for changing the steering box. When you get into the mid-year 67 with the collapsible steering wheel or steering columns, where they have the rag joint on them, steering box is a piece of cake. Just take the bolt out of the rag joint, pull it off the steering box, drop the steering box, put the new steering box in. But these long shaft steering columns do add to the challenge of servicing these cars, and it's something that just be patient, and you know you might have a few choice curse words over the job if you have to do it with the engine in the car. Anyways, again, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave comments below. You can also reach out to me on Instagram and Facebook and via email. The information is in the description. I thank you for watching. Be safe out there, and I will see you in the next video.